imagination about Dharamshala and how Dharamshala is political capital and how it's connected with the rest of the Tibetan refugees. We'll put up such a so if you look at my resume, everything has to do with Tibetan issue or Tibetan struggle. So now I see many campaign among the Tibetans in exile talking about more parliamentary reforms, structural reforms in the Exile Tibetan Democracy setup. A mixed vegetable in the in the momo, like you have put vegetable as well, mixed with meat. So I used to, when I seek leave on March 10th from my manager, I used to text them saying that this is the day I lost my father. She took it very personally, and then I explained her the reason. China, get out of Tibet. In unison. It was wonderful to hear. And then in the streets, it was nice. Normally, nobody talks about Tibetan freedom, right? But then the moment somebody tries to write a serious article or a poem, or if somebody displays only the Dalai Lama's picture, you'll be cracked down. Whether it's in settlements or everywhere in Toronto, people are very creative. It's just that their voices are not being sort of represented.
Unsilenced, Voices of Young Tibetans is a podcast presented by the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, where young Tibetans share their personal stories, experiences, opinions, and journey in exile.
Tashidalek, namaste, and welcome to our FNVA podcast, Unsilenced, Voices of Young Tibetans. In today's episode, we will discuss Tibet, the Tibetan Freedom Movement, the Tibetan Uprising Day, and the Exile Tibetan Democracy through the lens of a researcher and a Tibetan who has worked for many sons at Dharamshala and has a keen knowledge of the Exile Tibetan community. Many young Tibetans view our guest as one of the best young Tibetan resource person out there. He's taken part and led various seminars, sessions, and has also written on a plethora of subjects on Tibet and Tibetans. So without any further ado, I welcome to our show our guest, Tenzin Nyinjey.
Thank you, Damdul. Thanks for having me.
So, Nyinjey, before we start with our serious topics, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Oh yes. I was born in Tibetan settlement in Orissa in 1978, but I don't know when I was exactly born. My mom said it was like a heavy, sort of like rainfall at the time, probably maybe in June, I guess. So that's where I was born, and I finished my primary and secondary education in the Tibetan refugee school in Orissa itself. And then I moved for the first time outside my village, to Simla. Probably there's another refugee school in Simla, where for the first time I saw the snows, for my higher education, high school, like grade 11 and 12. And then I had a chance to go to Delhi University for my undergrad studies, where I did my BA in political science at the Rangtsen College. Probably you're from TU. And then I was jobless, sort of stuck in a limbo for a year in Delhi. And then 2001, I moved to the Tibetan college in Sara, near Dharamshala, where I studied Tibetan for 3 years. And then I moved to Kanki. I started working in the Department of Information. I worked there for 4 or 5 years. And then again, I moved on to the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives for 2 years. And then I moved to the United States for studies. And then I came back to India again, worked in the Kashak for a year, and then another 4 or 5 years in the Center for Human Rights and Democracy. And that was in up to, I think, 2016. And then I moved back to North America. And since 2016, I've been in Canada. So that's roughly my sort of biography.
Definitely, Nyinjey. A very interesting journey from the humble beginnings from Orissa to the first a major city called Shimla, and eventually to Delhi, and eventually at the end of the day you reach the political capital of the Tibetan exile community at Dharamshala, where you spent number of years, fruitful years, I would say.
Yeah.
So thank you for this, very nice introduction. And I think a lot of Tibetans also undergo this journey, like how they start from a village. Like even someone like me, I was born in Uti. Like it's like a small Tibetan community is there. Gradually, you go to the cities, and eventually you work for your Tibetan community. So you mentioned how you grew up in India, and growing up in India as an exiled Tibetan community and as a refugee. Were there any Eureka moments that came across you while growing up, and is there something that you would share with us?
I don't know. I don't know what Eureka actually is, to be honest. I know what it means, but in the Tibetan context, Eurekas are not like supposed to be parts of our culture. But I don't know what you're saying. It, but um, you know, I mean, okay, I can call this as a Eureka. When I was a little kid in Orissa, I was good in Tibetan language. So we used to receive one sort of a literary magazine. It's more of a comic magazine in Tibetan, published by the Department of Education in Dharamshala, and it has like features news stories, some like, and then it has a cartoon, sort of a beautiful cartoon story. And in that story, I read about a little sort of story about one Tibetan woman from South India visiting Dharamshala for the first time and going to a Momo restaurant. So the story goes is that the Momo restaurant was like full of people, lots of crowd out there, and then when she comes to the restaurant, she doesn't get a proper seat. And at the end of the story, the restaurant owner actually apologizes to her, saying that Dharamsala is a very busy place, so that's why we couldn't offer you a proper seat. And the lady sort of shoots back and saying that, yeah, Dharamsala is so busy that you have a mixed vegetable in the in the momo, like you have put vegetable as well, mixed with meat. So that story was sort of like a Eureka moment, if you call it, because that just gave me this fascinating imagination about Dharamsala and how Dharamsala is political capital and how it's connected with the rest of the Tibetan refugees. So yeah, I mean, these sort of like stories, you can call it Eureka moments. Then I had other stories that I read in the Tibetan historical texts, which were like quite fascinating. And then these days, I keep on having Eureka moment all the time.
Could you share any one of them? Like, would you like to share, like, since you have a lot of recurrence of these Eureka moments?
Until you realize as a Tibetan, you don't take it seriously, right? I mean, it happens. But you're right. It's very important to have these kind of like exciting moments, in life. Probably that's the first sort of Eureka moment in my life, you can call it, to be honest.
And by any chance, was that magazine the one that they call Payul? Like, even when
Yeah,
I was small,
exactly.
I remember that one. Like, at the end of the thing, and I think the magazine cover was also pretty good in quality,
Yeah.
And we as
Very
kids,
important.
we like the color things. And at the end of the thing, yeah, as you mentioned, they had these cartoons. And an interesting thing, there was also a pen pal section, if I'm not wrong. Unfortunately,
Probably I don't remember though. Yeah.
yeah,
But yeah,
interesting.
pen pal was a big phenomenon during our
Yep.
school days. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, some of the kids used to have pen pals with other kids from other areas, and I found
Mm.
it very fascinating. I was very jealous of them because
Yep.
I couldn't do so.
Yeah. I think in a way I share the same sentiments, like even I couldn't get anywhere. So yeah, Nyingla, and moving on, like you've also mentioned how since 2016 you have been settled in North America, in particular Canada, I must assume. So for the past few years, could you find any sort of difference between living in Canada and living in India?
Yeah, a lot of difference, to be honest, and but it's also like very much same in the sense that I can tell you about the difference is the fact that here, people. I live in a city in Toronto, right? It's a big urban city, whereas in India, obviously, I was living in Dharamshala, a very small hill town, right? You can see beautiful mountains and clean air. But here, it's, as I said, it's town. So you'll see railways, you'll see aeroplanes, you'll see cars moving past. And here also, it's very sort of busy in the sense of your work. Back in India, I was doing as a researcher, I was working in the office. But here, obviously there's no Tibetan research office, right? In Canada, nobody will put up such a research. If you look at my resume, everything has to do with Tibetan issue or Tibetan struggle. So nobody has such sort of organizing. So I have to work as a general labor, like rest of the people. So then I have to work, and then I have to do my own research readings. So that's like the most probably the only difference that I see in my own personal life. But then if you talk about general sort of perspective, here the problem again is, the city is rich, of course, but the problem here is that because it's so rich and people are so lost in their own world, there's not much sort of appreciation for the wealth and the beauty that you possess here in Canada. I'm talking about general people.
Yep.
Of course, I don't blame them because they don't have any sort of like alternative sort of worldview. Whereas people are coming from India, for instance, to me, the moment I see, say, for instance, a beautiful restaurant, or if I get a chance to eat in a restaurant, I just feel so much gratitude. For like few seconds, I'll stop myself and say, like, enjoy and relish, without eating the food. But here, since they don't have gone through the struggle that we went through, so people don't really appreciate, which is very sad. I call it often jokingly call it poverty of the plenty. There's so much you're not able to appreciate. But India, right? We know that, right?
Yep.
We get a little bit of like good things, then we really cherish, and so that's the difference. And then obviously India, I think it's kind of more relaxed and laid back, and so. But here you have to really work, and because the system is so sort of tied against the working class that you have to work paycheck to paycheck. And if you don't continue your work, probably you'll be kicked out from your rented rooms. So being busy is not something that people enjoy. It's just that they are being forced to do. So that's the difference.
And since you mentioned paycheck to paycheck, like one thing that I noticed, maybe I'm wrong, like you can, put your thoughts on that. But what I see with the Tibetan community abroad is there is this sense of, how should I put it, like convenience, should I say? Like, let's say like today was an occasion like Pension Rinpoche's birthday, but they tend to not celebrate on that day, but they push it on a weekend, like. So what is your thought on that, Nyinjey?
Yeah, I mean, you probably know, you have your own answers in your question. It's because of the economic conditions, right? Until and unless you celebrate the festivals on Saturdays, it's then obviously if you don't do that, you lose your job. So that's more of an economic necessity. But I mean, this is not, to be honest, like, there's no, I mean, Tibetans are timeless, right? I mean, whether you organize it on Saturday or Sunday, who cares? Right? As long as you organize, that's what matters. But I think it's because of that.
So now, like, let's move deeper to the subject. So, as we all know, like, it's been more than a decade since His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama handed over the political authority to a democratically elected leader. So, what is your overview of the developing political climate in our diasporic community since then?
I think it's a very sort of deep, sort of profound, sort of complex question, as you know it. It's very exciting, to be honest, given the political changes that we have seen over the last few years because of His Holiness's withdrawal from direct political responsibility. But at the same time, it's also, I would say, kind of very fraught with a lot of dangers, lots of crises that we have seen from our own eyes. And I think right now, it's very, very important for Tibetans to sort of like kind of sort of withdraw a little bit and then reflect and then try to have a very sort of open but honest internal conversation among themselves. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that, in the past, It's a typical Tibetan attitude. When you sort of like openly talk about things like in publicly, and they'll not mention the drawbacks and the crisis and the problems. But when you close your doors and then when you're on your private lives, then people will talk about all the problems and people will be open. So my hope and my appeal is that it's time now for Tibetans to open up and talk these things publicly. But it's a big challenge. I mean, these are being publicly talked about right now in social media and in the parliament. But there has to have a way to talk. Rather than right now, as you know, it's more of a sort of Trump style, like being trying to muscle each other out, and not in that sense, but I'm talking about diplomacy, but not in a negative sense, but being open, honestly talk about issues, but in a more sort of gentle, civil manner. But we have to talk about the issues that we know that is sort of buried under the surface, and so it's my hope that it's very exciting, to be honest. Because now nobody can sort of like avoid those issues. It has to be. It will come out in the public. There's no doubt about it. But the challenge, as I said, is how you're gonna articulate it. When we talk about democratic reforms, it's not just I'm talking about politically. Democracy cannot be sort of pigeonholed only into the political structures. You can talk about democracy in your own offices, right? If someone is working in a hospital, whether the hospital is run democratically and creatively, in the schools, in the homes. And so there's so many things we can talk about.
So, I would like to ask about the parliament, because one thing that I noticed, I went through the charter before our session here, one of the criteria for eligibility was there was no particular mention of the level of education needed, maybe it was set up way back, the charter was formally, published and printed out on 1991. Eventually it got amended. But in a way, do you think that some changes are necessary on that level itself in our parliamentarians, eligibility criteria, let's say, like in formal education? Because thinking back, 20, 30 years back, we could understand that Tibetans, due to the very plight that we were facing, a lot of the Tibetans had to skip school and work for Dharamshala. But that is not the case anymore.
Right.
So what is your thought on that, Nyinjey?
It's a very relevant question, because whether it's in parliament or whatever in life, you have to be educated, right? Now the question is education can be of different types. They can be formal and informal education. Some people are formally very educated, may have big degrees, but they can be really stupid, right?
Yep.
Whereas some people may not even know how to read and write, but can be very wise. If you look at Tibetan history, Tenzin is supposed to be, he's a hero and he just built the Tibetan Empire, but there's this story that he was an illiterate guy. So the question, you are right, people have to be wise and educated. And again, your point is correct, because if you, for instance, in the parliament or whether in the bureaucracy, you have to, apart from the fact that you know about Tibetan and Tibetan culture, Tibetan language, Tibetan history, I think you should also know about English as well, so that you can read about what's happening in other parts of the world. Right.
Indeed.
So in that sense, you're right. But then, as I said, if you really formally put up a criteria saying that somebody has to have a degree, MA degree or BA degree to be eligible to be a member of parliament, that can probably have some issues as well. They might kick out some really modern day Gar-like people as well, some really wise who doesn't know English, but very intelligent people,
Yep.
So that we have to think about that. Whether we want to put a formal sort of criteria or not. But you're right on the spot when you say that education is very important. So that's what I'm saying. If somebody that is why I often tell people, say for instance, why don't you translate some of the wonderful works on Tibetan struggle, say for instance on international relations itself, by papers by, for instance, papers by Dawa Nobu, or books by him into Tibetan. You have like a bunch of Tibetans who are good in both English and Tibetan, and I see now it's beginning. Some of the works by Elliot Spelling has been translated into Tibetan, and if you translate these more works of these, and then obviously those who doesn't speak English, they can have access to the knowledge through the Tibetan translation, and they can also promote Tibetan language as well. So even if they didn't go to college, by reading the Tibetan, they'll get the insight, right?
Yep.
So it's about giving access to education that you're talking about.
Definitely, Ninjala. You raised very interesting points. Firstly about how, like what is the criteria of education itself. So I was pushing this thing, and in a way, you brought an interesting point out about Gartongzen, and maybe even there might be a lot of modern day Gartongzen here and there in our Tibetan community. We never know. And on top of this, like when it comes to Tibetan writers who have written on Tibetan, like their text should be translated in Tibetan so that the larger Tibetan audience can get access to it. So yeah, very interesting. And I think we must work forward on that route itself.
Yeah. And also not just writers, but even if you, as you said, if you observe an ordinary Tibetan, whether someone is working in the restaurant or whether someone, I don't know, doing sort of normal work, whether it's in settlements or everywhere in Toronto, people are very creative.
Mm.
It's just that their voices are not being sort of represented. So if you're a writer, I don't see any writer writing about an ordinary sort of quote unquote normal Tibetan. And as he's saying that the genius is to bring out the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Mm.
So in that sense, so
Indeed.
you see like anyone, right? Someone sweeping the streets of Ganki. If you look at his or her life, there's a lot of creativity out there. These things needs to be brought up.
Mm.
Not just, of course, and then we have the sort of high and the mighty sort of academics. Their work can also be translated, and which is being translated as well. Right from the beginning, that's the Tibetan sort of history, right? The
Mm.
Lhotsawars, they've been translating the works of the Indian philosophers. And what about the ordinary? Bringing the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Definitely, Ninja. I think Tibetans should bring the subaltern voices. Like
Yeah.
it's being blocked since now, and I think there have been movements like,
No, that
like
is why I'm very excited. I keep watching all these blogs. No, they call
mm,
it blogs, right? All these
yeah,
people, quote unquote, they're not. They're really, it's wonderful. It's up. I mean, it depends on your voice. I find them very exciting and extraordinary. I find beautiful stories, very genuine, very spontaneous, and the fact that it's videography is just beautiful. You see all the scenes. It's just amazing. Some people don't see that
yep,
because probably they have been so hooked onto all this like aura about like big sort of writers and filmmakers that they don't even look up to them. They say, oh, but to me, it's very exciting. Coming back to the story that you and I talked about that in the pilot, it's a very little story
yeah.
about more restaurants. It's how you look at it.
Indeed, like I think a lot of our Tibetan history, in a way, it's recorded through these blogs. Like now we might look at it differently, maybe say 10 or 20 years down the line. In a way, history is being visually recorded there, like
Yeah,
Tibetan history, that too.
yeah.
So very interesting.
So I'm that is what I'm saying with the rise of social media and the withdrawal of his always from political scene, all this like the storms, I find it very exciting.
Indeed, Ninja, indeed. And now, you have been a researcher and you continue to research on Tibetan and Tibet relating things. And, even I've read a few of them, including, the censorship and struggle for Tibetan independence and the heart of the matter, the latter, which I really appreciate reading. And I think the audience should also read it. And it's published on the popular Tibetan English e-media Payul. So, in your view, Ninjala, what was the hardest challenge that you face and you continue to face when it comes to researching onto your Tibet? And what are your thoughts on the sufferings that Tibetans in Tibet, especially them, have to go through day in and day out?
I think biggest challenge when I was a so-called researcher or student of Tibet when I was working in Dharamshala was the inability to articulate, what you really feel. It's very difficult. So I'll tell you, you asked me about what I think about this, the suffering inside Tibet. For instance, at the office that I used to work, we used to interview Tibetan political prisoners from inside Tibet. And I remember there was this very sort of giant sort of man. I think he endured probably 4 or 5 years in the labor camp, and he talked about all the struggles that he went through in the labor camp. And strangely, at that time, I was reading Solzhenitsyn's work on labor camps in Russia at the time. So all of a sudden, like once I finished my work at 5, and I went to McLeodganj, and right in the streets, all of a sudden, I just had a sort of emotional sort of breakdown. I just couldn't control tears, like I was sort of crying. So emotionally, it's very draining. So what I mean by that is that probably at that time I was not able to sort of differentiate or reconcile. Of course, like whether it's Solzhenitsyn or a Tibetan political prisoner going through labor camp, there's a similarity, right? Both are like both have like Gulag systems, and
Yep.
both were communist regimes. But then there's also a lot of differences as well. And probably I couldn't sort of figure out, the nuances, the differences. That's why I had a sort of meltdown. In other words, what I'm saying is that it's very difficult for a Tibetan because you are deeply emotionally involved into the struggle yourself, and at the same time do research. That combination. It's very difficult to possess the combination where you can be emotionally involved, but at the same time you can be mentally strong as well. That is like the most difficult challenge. Otherwise, if it's a foreigner observing on Tibet, probably it's easier for them because they are not personally involved. For a Tibetan, it's very difficult.
Indeed, Nyinjey, like being a Tibetan, especially looking through it from your own lens, like looking what your ancestors and even your, generation a bit older than you, what they've gone through, and talking with them, it's very difficult. And you mentioned we tend to not tend to we become emotional, and I think we should accept that as well. It's not like a
It's
negative point which a
no,
lot of people tend to connotate with it,
no,
but
no, no. The emotion is is a source of strength.
hmm,
I was talking about if you could sort of can be emotionally sort of involved, at the same time you can be mentally strong, sort of
hmm,
reconcile this, then the expression that you will make, nobody can sort of surpass that.
indeed,
Then, then you will see a Tibetan, maybe things fall apart. A Chinua Achebe. So the emotional thing is a source. It can be a source of strength. So we cannot sort of like look down upon it or undermine it.
indeed, Nyingche. And I definitely echo the sentiments that you shared here. And recently, like Tibetans throughout the world have remembered and commemorated the 64th anniversary of the Tibetan Uprising Day on 10th March. So, what do you think the message it sends, even after 60 years? And do you think, in a way, the younger generation are really able to get something from it? Because the uprising day, in a way, not only is a way of protest, but it also brings Tibetans from all of walks of life together. That's what I witnessed when I saw the protest and took part in it recently at Delhi.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's March 10 is the day when Lhasa, the Tibetan capital was fell down, and then we became refugees. So that's the day we became rootless, right? I used to, when I seek leave on March 10 from my manager, I used to text them saying that this is the day I lost my father. She took it very personally, and then I explained her the reason. So you have no choice as a Tibetan, whether you are directly involved in it or not. This is going to affect you. And March 10 obviously is the symbol. So now the choice is up to you whether you want to find a way in which you want to actively involve, whether it's in March 10 or in your daily life as a Tibetan. The fact that we talked about, right? You already know Tibetan language very well, but then whether you want to study English and then try to, learn new insights and knowledges from the outside world and then live fully as a Tibetan, or if you don't do that, it's going to affect you as well. You will suffer from alienation. You'll go through emotional traumas, and then I see it everywhere as well. But the good thing about the Tibetans is that exile Tibetans are quite thriving, And one of the reasons is because the moment we reach exile, His Holiness and the Indian government, the Nehru, they established the Tibetan schools where we learn Tibetan language, Tibetan history, and then we also learn English. And now, as you know, all these younger generations growing up, these are bilingual, educated young Tibetans. So they already have the base. And I see them doing quite well, in daily lives here at the workplace. You have Tibetans, and the impression is very good. And co-workers among the foreigners, they say, "Oh, you guys are really sincere, hardworking people." But as I said, there's also a lot of lapses. This laid-back Tibetan attitude. For instance, if they organize some festivals or talk shows, they'll organize it well, but you always find something missing. And it's because of the laid-back attitude. And so if we can pull that up and then try to live fully, then I think it's a wonderful sort of opportunity. And then it's very nice to see lots of passion among the Tibetans, as you said, on March 10th. I was there yesterday. It was the stormiest and the coldest March 10th even in Canada. It was really cold, full of snowstorms. And then we started walking, and then I started young people screaming and protesting. And then the slogan that I heard about China, get out of Tibet, in unison, it was wonderful to hear. And then in the streets, it was nice. Normally, nobody talks about Tibetan freedom, right? Everybody suppresses that. The top political sort of establishments, but on that yesterday on the street, when thousands of people screaming, it was very nice. I was really enjoying looking at the faces of the bystanders, these foreigners, because these are the people who are their own government are denying the right to Tibetan freedom. So it's very nice to see, a group of Tibetans, thousands of them, screaming in their faces the truth that has been suppressed.
Indeed, Nyinjey, and those slogans as well, like China, 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 out, out, out. The message that it's carried, it may sound simple to an extent, but it's very potent and very strong.
And especially if you the chanting or the slogan, if it's done in a unison, crescendo, and it's especially led by young people, it's very nice.
Indeed, Nyinjey. So, moving on from the 10th March Uprising Day, focusing on China itself, it's a known fact that the People's Republic of China this year is being tested on all fronts. And many are even optimistic that an eventual change now looks more possible than ever. What are your thoughts on China and its current predicament? And also on top of this, right now, the so-called 2 sessions of the PRC is underway, and I think Xi Jinping, formally was announced as the president for an unprecedented third term. So how do you think all of this will influence PRC's governing in Tibet?
To be honest, now, as you know, the Chinese have become so powerful, right? It's the world's manufacturing sort of hub. And if you look at the economic relations that China has with other countries all over the world, every country, their largest trading partner is China. So under such scenario, I think probably we need to sort of have a different sort of perspective, a paradigm shift in terms of how we look at China. Obviously, the Chinese will continue suppressing or undermining the Tibetan dreams for freedom or independence. Obviously, the Chinese will continue that. But At the same time, I think the Chinese are sort of like right now inside Tibet. They're kind of very smart. If you look at how they use their skills in sort of neutralizing the Tibetan struggle. They are very rich, and then they have all the technologies. There's a huge military inside Tibet. You cannot move an inch. When you, for instance, try to send an email, no, not email, sorry, try to send some money, you'll be caught and put in prison. So it's a very difficult. But on the other hand, the Chinese allow if the Tibetans do some gorges, and if they go on a pilgrimage and prostrate, they'll allow that. But then the moment somebody tries to write a serious article or a poem, or if somebody displays his own as Dalai Lama's picture, you'll be cracked down. So the Chinese have this option now, to play that game, that long game. So this is something we have to keep in our mind. I see young Tibetans inside Tibet making blogs again about how he travels all over Tibet to beautiful places, to pilgrimage sites, and talk to ordinary Tibetan people. So these are like, as I said, a new sort of challenges that we have, a new perspective we need. And then again, you talk about the recent the NPC, National People's Congress Movement, but that's more of a rubber stamp parliament. But we know what happened out there. I read the reports yesterday, and for the first time, the Chinese president has openly acknowledged or accepted the so-called the great power competition thrown at him by the American government. And so it looks like there's this open sort of acknowledgement that the Chinese and the West, led by the Americans, will have a sort of confrontation. And obviously, the key issue is Taiwan, as you know. And I was reading yesterday, I was watching news about American top intelligence officials addressing the Senate, And in that interview, the intelligence czar of the Americans, Avril Haines, has openly acknowledged that the one China policy with regard to the Taiwan is almost over. So, as you said, there's a lot of sort of the Americans are trying to put pressure on the Chinese through military alliances. But the problem is that what about the economic sort of pressure? The Chinese are putting economic pressure back on the Americans. And without a strong economy, how can you continue the arms race? Because you need money. But as I said, the Taiwan is like something is really dangerous, and probably in 3-4 years, I don't know, something will happen. The question is, obviously, the Chinese will take Taiwan back, and whether the Taiwanese can resist or not, whether the Americans will able to intervene. So it's a very sort of dangerous part. And then if that happens, then obviously right, what will happen. The big crisis all over the world. And for Tibetans, as I said, we need a sort of different sort of perspective. Sort of like more sort of, we can't have that typical, the old school sort of, paradigm. The world has changed a lot. Even inside the Tibetan community, we changed, right? We saw it in exile, right? So it is my hope that the Tibetan intellectuals can sort of open up to this sort of new sort of changing environment, and then try to. And in our case, like, I think it's a great opportunity, to be honest. We speak 3 languages, right? We know English, and then we know Tibetan. So through Tibetan, you can learn about your own civilization history. You can draw strength from there, from Tibetan songs, Tibetan history, Tibetan literature. And then from English, obviously, you can learn about the world. So we have this sort of like a dynamic perspective. Here, like in the West, it's just sort of unilateral perspective. As I said in the beginning of our interview, they only see about the West. So they don't know what's happening on another part of the world. But whereas you and I, we saw what's happening in the global South, and then we know what's happening in the West. It's like having 2 choices. We can sort of be more sort of creative. But we have to take advantage. But that's the thing. But if we don't take advantage, if we go on the usual way of things, then people will take advantage out of us.
Indeed, Nyingjala, you mentioned a very pertinent point about, like how times have changed, and we Tibetans also should not only move along with the time, but use the dynamic aspect that we have gained, of being multilingual and bilingual in that sense, and also having the perspective of both the global south and global north. So indeed, I also feel like what you say, like we should definitely move across that path and continue on that, and not be left behind to a certain degree, because in some ways that was one of the major reasons why we Tibetans, unfortunately, lost our nation, lost our territory, because we were not able to keep up with the time. And like going along this line itself, like I would like to ask you, like what sort of Tibet do you see, let's say 20 years down the line?
I think it depends. To be honest, when you talk about Tibet now, it's not just inside Tibet, right? You have the Tibetan diaspora as well. In 20 years down the line, His Holiness probably will not be there. So this is something we have to think about. Again, if you want to see any changes, then you should be able to make the changes, right? The changes will not happen on its own. It also depends on outside circumstances as well, right? It also depends on yourself, how you're going to change structurally. As I said, how you're going to change your mindset and prepare for it. So what I'm trying to say is that it is up to the Tibetans what changes they want to see and whether they are willing to make those changes as well. Now I see many campaign among the Tibetans in exile talking about more parliamentary reforms, structural reforms in the Exile Tibetan Democracy setup. I mean, His Holiness has already begun. He talks about secular ethics now, right? He doesn't talk about next life, and he talks about secular ethics. He talks about separating religion from politics. That's the broader framework, but now you have to go into the institution and actually make the changes. And that will spill over, right? In the form of whether the changes we'll see in the Tibetan schools, in the parliament, in day-to-day life. And that will empower the Tibetans. And then probably a change will come. Otherwise, it's very difficult to say, if people don't make the change, how can I say? Or then there will be no change. It will be the same thing after 20 years. Yeah. So inside Tibet, that change has been coming in for a long, long time among the Tibetan intellectuals. Probably nowadays, yesterday I saw many people raising the placard of Sherab Gyatso, a Hmong intellectual who is in prison right now. If you read his works, his published works, his books, he's talking about all the things that I'm talking about. One of his works, the Spirit of Nalanda, is actually published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. And if you read the preface that he wrote in that work, he exactly talks about that. The need for the Tibetans to make their changes. And I see sprouts of changes. As I said, the big framework is there, and now the Tibetans will actually go out there and make the changes. It depends on that.
Indeed, Nyingjala, you mentioned a very pertinent point about, Sherab Gyatso and his writing and his current predicament as well. It's very sad to see such a very high intellectual who is capable of a lot of things, but is in a way behind bars because of his own expression. So it's very sad to see that. So, Nyingjala, we are short on time, unfortunately. So I would like to put forth this last question to you, and that is whether you have any messages to our fellow Tibetans and the plethora of Tibetan supporters around the world who continue to stand in solidarity with us Tibetans when it comes to the Tibet-China conflict.
I can't speak much for the Tibetan supporters, because these people are really they are free and independent people, right? So I don't have any advice to them. So they're very good in whatever things they are doing. And when I read about their statements, their general statement is that whatever the Tibetans do, whatever options they make, they're going to support that. And as I said, personally, they are very well established and very intelligent. So I don't have any. But To the Tibetans, especially, I can probably, since this is about the youth, I can probably say something about the so-called Tibetan youth. Older people, I can say much. They're older and they're wise. For the youth, as I said, it is a great, great opportunity for the Tibetans, especially in diaspora. People talk a lot about what's happening inside Tibet. That's too far, right? And even if you want to do something about Tibetans inside Tibet, first you have to be strong, right? So first work on yourself. And in exile, I know there are so many distractions and crises, but then also there's a lot of opportunities. Right? I'm talking about especially the youth. Everybody has a chance to go to school, right? Everybody knows how to read and write. And then once you finish your school, all the facilities out there. The libraries out there. You don't go hungry, right? You have enough to eat. The libraries are there to read. And then once you arm yourself with education, you will find a way out. I very much regret when I was in the college. Although I was one of probably the most studious, the most studious Tibetan student, but I regret a lot because I wasted a lot of time. The biggest regret that I had was I did not work, actually. Probably I should have worked in a restaurant, On the one hand, I should read, study, and on the other hand, I should have worked in a restaurant, which is what most of the youth here are doing. So probably I think if you're a college student in Delhi, you'll get a sort of a normal, decent job, right? Any kind of job you should do. And then obviously you go to college and read. There's an opportunity. Many people don't have that opportunity in India. Right? In India, how many people have a chance to go to school and leave alone college, go to school? 70% of Indians are living in rural areas. And I came from Indian rural area. There's no primary school. Even if there's a school, the food is not good enough. There's no nutrition. But the Tibetans have everything. So if they realize how sort of lucky how much opportunity they have, and if they take it, then they can fly and probably do wonderful things. So this is my appeal. I know I've been appealing this all the time, but it's very difficult because there's so many distractions, YouTube and.
Indeed, Nyinjey. Thank you for sharing with us this wonderful, wonderful messages, and especially at the end, you really brought out a very much needed echo for our Tibetan youngsters, how there is a plethora of opportunity to us. So it's only upon us whether we take it or not. Yeah. So on that note, I would like to end our session today and would humbly and kindly like to thank our guest today, Nyinjey, for taking time out of his own life to, come to our podcast and share his thoughts on Tibet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Damdul. Thanks for having me. And I'm very happy that you're doing wonderful things. And, in the beginning of our conversation we had, I asked about, what school did you go and what are your plans? And I'm very much inspired by what you said, that you want to continue, doing studies. And so this is exactly what the young people should do. So thank you very much.
Also, thank you.
Bye.
For more updates and videos by FNVA, click on the link and please subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.